Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we are going to take a closer look at some opening weekend box office numbers for two very different movies that came out this weekend.
Yeah.
Disney's reimagining of Snow White and Robert De Niro's new mobster film, Alto.
All right.
So we've got all the early data, initial reactions, and what we really want to dive into today is what these opening weekend performances tell us about the future of these films and maybe what they indicate about some broader trends we're seeing in the movie industry right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right, so let's start with Snow White.
Yeah.
So Snow White actually led the domestic box office over the weekend with $43 million, which
Yeah.
on the surface that sounds like a success.
Right.
But globally,
Yeah.
it brought in a total of $87.3 million.
Mm.
Now, that's actually a little bit lower than the $100 million that a lot of the industry experts had projected.
Okay.
So what are your initial thoughts when you see numbers like that?
Well, I think 43 million domestic is enough to take the top spot.
Right.
I mean, it's not a disaster.
Not a disaster.
But I think when you look at the global number,
Right.
and it's a little softer than maybe expected, I think.
Right.
It does make you wonder if maybe there was a little less enthusiasm internationally than perhaps was anticipated.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
for a film with a budget of this size, it's really that long-term endurance.
Right.
That's going to be key for success.
Exactly. And it is important to remember that Snow White actually did have a bit of a journey to the screen.
Oh, yeah.
There were a lot of debates surrounding the depiction of the Seven Dwarfs, some of the story changes that were made from the original, and even some calls for boycott, connected to the co-stars and some of their public statements on the Israel-Hamas conflict. And we even saw that they had to do some really expensive reshoots,
Yeah.
and that the premiere was kind of scaled back
Yeah.
to something a little bit less grand than what you would expect for a big Disney film.
Right.
But despite all that, the analysts that we've seen don't really think that all of that negative publicity had much of an impact on ticket sales.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's definitely possible
Yeah.
that the core family demographic, which is who they're probably really targeting here, were largely either unaware or unfazed by all that, kind of surrounding noise.
Right.
Families with younger children, like I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, like
Yeah.
my wife and I, we just want to go see a PG movie,
Yeah.
and so,
You're not
yeah, we're not really,
worried about the political stances of...
no, we're not really thinking about all that
Yeah.
stuff, and I think a lot of people are probably in the same boat.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
it is worth considering if some potential adult viewers,
Yeah.
maybe those that have like a real nostalgic connection to the original animated film,
Right.
maybe they were a little less inclined to check out this new version.
Right.
I think it's really tough to know for sure how much of an impact those external factors actually have on box office, but it's worth considering for sure.
Yeah. And what really jumps out to me is that even putting aside the controversies that surrounded the film,
Yeah.
$43 million for the opening weekend is actually the lowest we've ever seen for a live-action Disney remake.
Really?
It's actually even lower than Dumbo,
Yeah.
which, had that $45 million opening back in 2019, and that's not even adjusted for inflation.
Well,
And when you consider the absolutely massive openings that we've seen from some of the other Disney remakes, like The Little Mermaid,
yeah.
The Jungle Book, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, of course, The Lion King.
Right.
Several of which were either billion-dollar blockbusters or came really, really close.
Yeah.
This $43 million for Snow White just feels,
Yeah.
it feels a lot less impactful to me.
Yeah, I think that contrast is pretty striking. I think that earlier wave of Disney live-action remakes, they really did seem to just tap into this huge well of nostalgia and, pre-existing affection for those properties.
Right.
And they were often adaptations that, stuck fairly closely to the originals.
Right.
Maybe this softer opening for Snow White suggests one of a few things. Maybe there's a little bit of remake fatigue setting in with audiences.
Right.
Or maybe the specific choices that they made for this story just didn't resonate
Right.
as strongly with a wider audience as they had hoped for.
Yeah.
Or maybe the marketing just wasn't as effective,
Right.
at drumming up that same level of excitement that we saw with some of those earlier films that were so wildly successful.
Right.
It's tough to say.
Right, for sure. Yeah, and the financial stakes here are just enormous.
Right.
Snow White is reported to have a $250 million production budget.
Wow.
So to be considered a genuine success by Disney,
Yeah.
it needs to have some serious legs.
It's going to have to stick around.
Yeah, at the box office.
For a while.
For a while. And, some of the reports that we've seen, they've actually been drawing comparisons to Dumbo, which had a really lackluster global total of only $353 million.
Yeah.
And even The Little Mermaid, which, while, it made a lot of money,
yeah,
it's still kind of underperformed relative to those really, really high expectations.
Yeah.
With a global total of $569 million.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure.
That's a lot of pressure for Snow White to perform well in the coming weeks.
Absolutely.
To even come close to some of those other Disney remakes.
Yeah, with a budget of that size,
Right.
I mean, anything less than a truly, global performance is probably going to be considered a disappointment.
Right.
And the parallel with Dumbo is actually really interesting to me because that was another film that came from a really beloved animated property.
Right.
But then when they turned it into this live action version,
right.
it just didn't seem to click with audiences in the same way. The Little Mermaid, while it did make a lot of money,
right.
it not reaching those blockbuster heights that everybody was predicting,
right.
it just really highlights how unpredictable these big budget remakes can be.
Right.
You just never know for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because Disney seems to be taking a much more optimistic stance.
Okay.
They're drawing comparisons to Mufasa, the Lion King prequel.
Yeah.
Which, did have a somewhat softer opening, but then showed some pretty good staying power.
Yeah.
And ended up having a really successful long-term run.
Okay.
So Disney seems to be thinking that, the brand recognition for Snow White, it's one of the originals.
Right.
Combined with the fact that there really isn't any direct family movie competition right now,
Right.
that could really allow Snow White to build momentum and actually have, a really strong run.
Okay.
And on top of all of that,
Yeah.
the initial audience reception actually seems to be pretty positive.
Yeah. We've got an A- grade from CinemaScore from women. Who made up almost 70% of the opening weekend audience.
Really?
And then a B+ from general audiences overall. So
wow. It seems like...
That's a pretty strong female skew in the audience.
Right.
That's interesting.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that positive audience response,
yeah,
particularly from that really big segment of female viewers, is a really big plus for Snow White.
Yeah.
Positive word of mouth can be super influential, especially for a movie that's aimed at families.
Right.
If those initial positive impressions that people are having lead to repeat viewings and recommendations, that could really help it gain some traction over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
The comparison to Mufasa is a good point, too.
Yeah,
A big opening weekend doesn't always
Yeah.
guarantee a long-term success.
Right.
And especially if it connects with its target demographic.
Right.
And like you said, with no direct family movie competition out there right now,
Right.
Snow White does have a pretty open playing field to find its audience.
Yeah. And, David A. Gross from Franchisor, he actually described the opening as, quote, a soft opening by Disney's historic standard. End quote.
Yeah.
And he really highlights that the film's ultimate success is going to hinge on whether it can hold strong over the next month or two.
Right.
Just like Mufasa did.
Yeah.
But he does emphasize Disney's really strong track record of being able to effectively support their films.
Right.
And, of course, the inherent value of their animated IP.
Yeah.
He notes that for a company like Disney, a theatrical release is just one part of the equation.
Right.
He describes Snow White as a potential merchandising goldmine.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously a very valuable addition to their theme park offerings.
Right.
So it's important to remember that broader ecosystem that Disney has.
Yeah, absolutely. For a company like Disney, the overall value of a property goes way beyond just the box office.
Right.
It's all the licensing, the merchandising,
Right.
the theme park tie-ins.
Yeah.
All that stuff represents huge long-term revenue streams for Disney.
Yeah.
And they contribute a lot to the overall value of their IP portfolio.
Right.
So even if Snow White doesn't quite hit those blockbuster numbers in theaters,
Yeah.
it can still be a very valuable asset for the company down the line.
Right.
For sure.
Okay, so now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Alto Nights, Robert De Niro's new mobster film.
Okay.
So the reports we've seen say that it basically crumbled.
Oh, no.
With a very low $3.2 million domestic debut.
Wow.
across 2,800 cinemas. It didn't even break into the top 5.
Really?
It ended up in 6th place.
Oh, wow.
And with a reported production budget of $45 million, it's being described as potentially shaping up to be a flop. Those are pretty strong words to be using with a film that has a star like Robert De Niro.
Yeah, you would think a film with his name attached would at least do better than that.
Right.
I mean, a $3.2 million opening on that many screens for a film starring Robert De Niro.
Right.
That's definitely disappointing, especially with that budget of $45 million, failing to even break into the top 5.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
That really indicates that there just wasn't a lot of interest from moviegoers
right
off the bat.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the box office numbers that were disappointing.
Yeah.
The film also received a B cinema score.
Woof. That's not great.
Which isn't a great sign.
Yeah.
And a really low 39% average rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Wow.
So it seems like the critics really did not like this film.
Yeah.
And, De Niro took on a double role. He plays 2 mob bosses.
Yeah.
So you'd think that star power, combined with the fact that it's kind of a classic genre,
right,
the mobster flick, might have actually helped to draw a bigger audience.
You would think so.
Yeah.
I mean, Robert De Niro, he is a legend, especially in the crime genre.
Right.
So the fact that he couldn't even generate more interest with a dual role, that suggests to me that there must have been some other factors at play here.
Right.
And I think the negative critical reception probably played a role.
Yeah.
It must have turned off a lot of potential moviegoers.
Right.
And then a B cinema score also suggests that even the people who did see it weren't really that excited about it.
Right.
It really highlights the importance of positive reviews and strong word of mouth for a movie to succeed in today's market.
Exactly. You need both of those things working in your favor.
Yeah, you really do.
And the reports also point out that this actually marks Warner Bros.' 2nd consecutive underperforming release.
Oh, wow.
After Mickey 17, which is also projected to lose a substantial amount of money for the studio. They even give us an update on Mickey 17, noting that it's now in its 3rd weekend.
Okay.
It's dropped to 5th place. It's grossed $40 million domestically and $100 million worldwide against a budget of $118 million.
Okay.
So that's not looking great either.
No.
It's really shaping up to be a pretty concerning picture for Warner Bros. Recent slate of films.
Yeah, 2 films underperforming like that back to back.
Yeah.
It really does raise some questions about what's going on over there at the studio.
Right.
And what kind of projects are really resonating with audiences.
Yeah.
I mean, Mickey 17, to see it continuing to decline in its 3rd week, despite the big budget, it just shows how challenging this current box office landscape is for studios.
Yeah.
It's tough out there right now.
And just to get a better sense of the overall landscape, we should also talk about some of the other films that are out there right now.
Yeah.
So Magazine Dreams, starring Jonathan Majors, had a really, really weak opening.
Wow.
Black Bag, on the other hand, actually showed some resilience with a solid 2nd weekend. Captain America, Brave New World.
Yeah.
While it is the biggest Hollywood release of the year so far, is still tracking below expectations.
Really?
Given its pretty large budget. And Novocaine saw a big drop in its 2nd weekend after a pretty strong debut.
Okay.
So, overall, it's a really mixed bag out there.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But I think the general sentiment seems to be pretty grim.
Yeah. This definitely reinforces the sense that it's just a very challenging marketplace right now.
Yeah.
While there are always some relative successes here and there.
Right.
The underperformance of some of these major releases, like Captain America, despite the fact that it did make a decent amount of money globally, along with the struggles that some of these new films are having, like Magazine Dreams and Alto Nights, it just paints this picture of an industry that's still trying to figure out, what audiences want, how to adapt to all the different economic factors that are going on.
Right.
It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah. It's a very complex situation right now. And, they do note in the reports that overall box office grosses are still way behind both last year's figures.
Wow.
And those from 2019.
Really?
However, they do mention some upcoming releases like a Minecraft movie and Thunderbolt as potential bright spots. and they even quote ComScore as predicting a, quote, more positive tune, end quote, for the box office in the coming weeks. So maybe there's some hope on the horizon.
Yeah, I think it's understandable why they're expressing that optimism for future releases.
Right.
I mean, in the industry, there's always this hope that the next big movie is going to be the one to turn everything around. And a Minecraft movie, that's got a huge built-in fan base. People love Minecraft. And then Thunderbolts is part of the MCU. And that's always popular. So they both have the potential to bring in really big audiences. Now, whether they can actually, reverse that downward trend remains to be seen. But they're definitely potential bright spots.
Exactly. They are potential bright spots on the horizon.
Yeah.
So to kind of sum everything up here, it seems pretty clear that Snow White's opening weekend was certainly a lot less stellar compared to some of Disney's other live-action remakes. And, its long-term success is far from guaranteed. It really hinges on how well it's going to hold up over the next few weeks. Alto Nights, on the other hand, it appears to have really stumbled right out of the gate. And it's highlighting that it can be really difficult to attract an audience, even with a really well-known star involved. If those critical reviews and those initial audience reactions are just overwhelmingly negative.
It seems like you need both.
Yeah.
You need the star power and you need people to like it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So what does all of this tell you about the current state and the future of these Hollywood blockbusters? And what are audiences really looking for these days?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, is brand recognition enough anymore?
Right.
Or are we seeing a real shift?
Yeah.
Where people are demanding more original stories.
Right.
They want to see good reviews. They want to hear from their friends that a movie is good.
Yeah.
Before they're willing to go out and see it.
Right.
I do think we might be at a turning point here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time.
I think Snow White's performance shows that relying on a brand name just might not be that automatic recipe for success that it used to be.
Right.
For these Disney remakes. And factors like, how much people enjoy it.
Right.
And how long it sticks around in theaters are becoming a lot more important.
Right.
And then Alto Nights. It just shows how important those good reviews are. And how important it is for people to actually enjoy the film for a movie to succeed in today's market.
Right.
I mean, star power is great.
Yeah.
It can get people interested.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if people don't actually connect with the film, it's just not going to work.
Right.
So, I do think we might be seeing a shift.
Right.
Where audiences are getting more selective.
Right.
And while those big brands still have a lot of pull, it does seem like originality and quality are becoming increasingly important.
Exactly.
For a film to really break through.
And cut through all that clutter.
And cut through all that clutter and convince people to spend their money at the movie theater.
Right. Yeah. It's a fascinating time to be following the movie industry.
It really is.
So much is changing.
Yeah.
And, we'll have to keep an eye on all of this as we move forward.
Absolutely.
All right. So that's going to do it for our deep dive today.
Okay.
But make sure you come back next week when we will take a look at some other interesting new releases.
Sounds good.
All right. Until then.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Bye, Aaron.